So today's topic is the women's movement of the 1800s. Our essential question, what problem did women face and how did they fight for rights? So you're probably familiar with some of the situations that women faced in the early 1800s. They did lack basic legal and economic rights. For example, women did not have the right to vote. It was actually illegal for them to try and cast a vote. Many of them could not hold property, and they were usually forbidden to speak in public. It was kind of that same rule that we apply to children nowadays, don't speak unless you're spoken to. That was applied to grown women. We talked about how many women, once they start making their own money, often that has to go to whatever man is considered to be, quotation marks, in charge of them, like their father, their brother, or maybe even their uncle. Formal education for women was pretty much unheard of, and much different than today. In the rare case of divorce, the husband was always granted custody of the children. There was a prevailing belief during this time in the cult of domesticity, and that was the idea that a woman's place was in the home. So therefore, it was not necessary to provide her with a formal education because she was resigned to domestic duties like having children, taking care of them, raising them, and household chores. With the Industrial Revolution, we see women begin to work outside of the home for the first time. As we can see here, this picture to the right, women often worked in factories. So this did give them some economic independence for really the first time in the nation's history. And once they got a little taste of that independence and freedom, soon they wanted even more. The Second Great Awakening opened many new opportunities for women. They were leaders of many of the reform movements that we talk about. You'll recall Dorothea Dix leading that movement for mental hospitals. And there are many other women that we're going to talk about that were involved in, obviously, the women's movement, but also the abolition movement against slavery. The woman here to the right, that is Sojourner Truth. She was an important leader within both the women's movement and the abolition movement. A very interesting figure if you're interested in looking more into her. That is Sojourner Truth. So the Seneca Falls Convention convened in 1848, and this is recognized as the nation's first women's rights convention. It was organized by these two ladies to the right, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. So this took place in Seneca Falls, New York. Women were invited from all over the North to attend this convention. While convened there at the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. So this was a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence. We know that key phrase, all men are created equal, that has formed the basis of equality here in the United States. Well, they altered that phrase to say all men and women are created equal. In the same way that the Declaration of Independence listed all of our grievances against Great Britain and why we wanted our independence, this also listed the grievances against society and against the patriarchy, all the basic freedoms that women lacked and that they wanted. So overall, the Declaration of Sentiments called for women's equality and suffrage. You'll remember that suffrage means the right to vote. That was a very radical idea in 1848. Many women even opposed the idea of women having the right to vote, and many of the more moderate organizers thought that the right to vote was going a little bit too far for this time period. But it's something that Elizabeth Cady Stanton will fight for her entire life. Two other women, Amelia Bloomer is seen right here. She is known for her bloomers, and maybe you've heard your grandma talk about bloomers. Typically nowadays they refer to underwear, But back then they were these little pants right here that allowed women to wear less restrictive clothing, to have more mobility and movement, and just be more comfortable in day-to-day life. Uh, Also, she wrote and published a newspaper called The Lily that advocated for women's equality. The other lady pictured here is Susan B. Anthony. You maybe have heard of her. She actually appears on the gold dollar coin in the US. She was close friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton that we talked about on the prior slide. She spent her entire life also fighting for the right to vote. In the 1870s, she tried to cast a vote to vote for President U.S. Grant, and was actually arrested for doing so. So she's going to remain an important figure all the way into old age, and unfortunately, she dies a few years before women received the right to vote in 1920. There are much more that we could talk about regarding the women's movement, but since they didn't have many achievements during this time period, we won't go into much more detail. Just know that, women have been advocating for equal rights really since the beginning of our nation.